Great to
Henry,
be here.
it sounds like you're impressed with the recurring revenue model.
This is a great business. No other way to say it. And just watching it take over our company a few years ago was amazing. We had a newsroom where everybody talked to each other with voice and using email, blasting out things. Suddenly the newsroom got totally silent. And I was noticing that my emails took a lot longer to get responses to. Nobody was checking. So where'd everybody go? It's like, dude, you're an old man. Join Slack. Everybody's on it. So it is just taken over. All the metrics look great. It's an incredibly high margin business ultimately, like Atlassian, like software, the Salesforce.com and others, just an incredible business.
Glenn, what is the market here? D.A. Davidson put out a note that said, or it was Atlantic Equities actually, that said that the market is 1.5 billion users. They said messaging is viral. WhatsApp taught us that. Is that what Slack could eventually become, from 10 million to something like 1.5 billion? Is that realistic?
Well, I think if you look at what's driving Slack's growth today, if you're a large company, you really need to drive innovation in your business, become more responsive to customers. And Slack is really a tool that helps you do that. Just as Henry mentioned, you can communicate one-to-one across work groups, across teams, across functions, or even across whole companies very simply and easily within Slack. And the platform itself is also very powerful because it brings in data from lots of other business applications in a very rich and integrated way. So I think the market for Slack is huge as a result because large companies are really driving towards innovation, and Slack is a real big, important piece of that puzzle.
What do we think about, I mean, Glenn, are we talking existential threat to email as we know it?
I do think from an internal email standpoint, as Stuart said earlier on your show, Stuart Butterfield, the CEO, email is reducing in volume as Slack is increasing in volume. And so that is definitely play number one for Slack, is to drive into internal email. Over time, if Slack is truly even more successful, they'll cross company boundaries and start to attack external email as well. But I think for now, internal email is definitely under assault with Slack.
But Henry, the company that's under assault from that is Microsoft. So what's stopping Microsoft from introducing a Slack killer and putting it in its stack and having all Microsoft users start using it?
They're late. It's network effect business. Once a company adopts it, to actually pull it out and switch to something else is very difficult. I would say it's ultimately going to be complementary to email. We still use email. We just use it a little bit differently. People still talk on the phone, believe it or not. All these different communication mechanisms just sort of layer in. They find a niche. We need all of them, but it is certainly taking over a lot of what we used to do with email.
Certainly, the relationship they have with consumers is feeding their awareness, which is why we're having this direct listing in the first place, right?
Exactly. If you didn't know that Slack existed, it'd be hard to be on the buy side of today's direct listing because you don't use it, you don't know anything about it. That's why only certain companies like Slack and Spotify, that have ample capital raised currently on the balance sheet. Slack has $800 million in cash right now. So as Stuart Butterfield said this morning on Squawk Box, they didn't need to do a capital raise. The listing was more just to allow, it was a liquidity event for employees and previous investors to just have an opportunity to sell their shares.
So Leslie, what is a textbook performance for a direct listing? Because we don't really have that many data points, and normally you would take a traditional IPO and say if it was priced well, it would rise 15 to 20%, stable trading throughout the day, no major glitches, no major drops or pops. But what is a perfect day for Slack?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because you're right. We can't do the money left on the table question. We're not really looking at performance. I mean, we're looking at it relative to the reference price. We're looking at it relative to where the shares were trading on the secondary markets. And so far, as Bob mentioned, at $36 a share, it'd be up about 35% from both the reference price and the average price they were trading at in May. But I would say success would be, relatively low volatility, no major technical glitches. We should look at this more from a technical standpoint as opposed to a performance standpoint, because really where they close today is going to be the first major data point in the public markets because the shares weren't sold at an IPO price.
Glenn, as an early investor, I'm sure your returns are going to be handsome, but does it matter to you how you get your exit, whether it's through a direct listing or an IPO?
Ultimately, the performance of Slack and its stock price over time is going to be a result of how they do from financially, and so the direct listing is certainly an interesting feature to the Slack debut. As was mentioned, they have a bunch of cash on their balance sheet, so they didn't really need to raise money in this event. And because people know the product, the marketing that comes along with an IPO wasn't that important to them. So I'm really more focused on how does the company perform over the next ensuing quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, and years out. I think the opportunity is vast, as I mentioned earlier, and that's, I think, what the big story here is about Slack.
So, Glenn, a company saying we don't need the money, how close does that tell you that they are to profitability?
Well, look, they've got over $800 million of cash on the balance sheet, and you can look at their quarterly results. As Henry mentioned earlier, gross margins in this business are very significant, and from a go-to-market standpoint, the company is quite efficient. So there really is reason to believe that Slack will be a very profitable company, just like other cloud software businesses that have preceded it. Gen 1 companies like Salesforce and Workday and ServiceNow.
2 years, 2 decades.
Oh, I don't think it's decades away by any stretch. I think that they will be profitable on this cash. If they had any doubt about that, then I'm sure Stewart would have considered raising money in this event.
And this is a business where it's actually smart for them to use huge marketing spending, get out there, get into companies, build the base. Over time, many years down the road, you can begin to dial back and suddenly you're wildly profitable. This is what Salesforce did. It's what Amazon has done, many others. I mean, this is a case where if you're on the board, just keep going for it. Get into these companies now. It's worth it. You'll get the return on the cash.